Even though I have a couple of workbenches that I've made for myself, sometimes depending on the project, maybe it's big or weird shaped or something, sometimes I end up working on the ground. And apparently that bothers you guys a lot. I get comments all the time that I need to get a pair of Sawhorses. So I actually have some Sawhorses, but I've never been a huge fan. Traditional wood Sawhorses are really big and heavy and cumbersome and kind of get in the way all the time. Plastic folding Sawhorses are inexpensive and easy to store, but in my experience, they're not very durable. They definitely don't pass the kick test. Raise your hand if you've ever accidentally kicked the corner of a Sawhorse and knocked everything to the ground. Yeah. More than once. Recently, my husband and I have started building our new house and detached workshop. Super exciting. But there are definitely times that we need Sawhorses in order to set big beams or long lengths of lumber or something. I decided there's got to be a better way, so I finally designed some super sturdy but foldable and portable Sawhorses. That will pass the kick test, I promise. This is a pretty simple project that requires only a circular saw and power drill. It's something even a beginner could tackle in a single afternoon. Whenever I'm using my circular saw, I like to grab a piece of foam insulation. The foam supports the material I'm cutting, allowing my blade to go all the way through and not worrying about damaging the surface underneath. I started by marking the lengths I needed to cut out of my 2x6 and 2x4 boards. I then adjusted the depth of my saw blade a little past the thickness of the material I was cutting. You want about 2 saw teeth sticking through the bottom. For all my components that needed to be cut square or at 90 degrees, I held a speed square against the plate of my circular saw to make sure I was getting nice square cuts. Some people with a really steady hand don't need a square and they can just freehand these cuts. I find it much easier to control the saw when I have a straight edge or something to run the saw against. To make the legs of the Sawhorse splay out slightly, they needed to be cut at an angle. I adjusted the blade angle of my circular saw to 15 degrees. Next, using the speed square again, I cut my first Sawhorse leg. I angled both ends of the leg in the same direction, creating a really long parallelogram. I then used that first leg to mark the exact length of the other 3 legs. Now that the legs were cut, in order to accommodate the hinges, I needed to remove a small triangular section from each point of the top of each leg. I set my blade to 45 degrees and then used a scrap piece of 2x4 as a support while I made a cut about half an inch from the top edge. One mistake I see a lot of DIYers make is not pre-drilling their wood before they drive screws. I highly recommend picking up a kit that has different drill bit sizes as well as different size and shape drivers. The hinges that I used are kind of unique but not hard to find. I used non-mortise heavy-duty door hinges. Non-mortise means you can attach them flush between 2 pieces of material without having to cut a groove or mortise into one of them. Unlike most hinges, the sides nest into each other, creating an overall thickness that's only about 1/8 of an inch. I pre-drilled and attached a hinge to each leg flush to the top edge. I wanted to beef up the strength of my Sawhorses, so I made an optional upgrade and bought 1 1/4 inch long screws to attach the hinges. The screws that come with the hinges are only about 3/4 of an inch long, which is fine, but the longer screw length will give me more stability. Next, it was time to attach the legs to the piece that goes under the top plate, which I'm going to call the runner. I measured the holes in my hinges and then transferred those markings so I could pre-drill into the runner. I recruited my husband to lend an extra set of hands, which definitely made attaching the legs easier, but you could do it yourself as well. If I was working by myself, I probably would have slid the Sawhorse close to a wall and then leaned the legs up against the wall for support. You can see in this shot I'm using 2 different tools. One is a cordless drill and one is called an impact driver. It's kind of like a drill, but as the name suggests, it has a little bit more guts and is better for driving screws and things like that. I highly recommend investing in an impact driver if you're going to build a lot of DIY projects. But if you don't have one, don't worry. A simple power drill will work just fine. Once all 4 legs were attached, we stood the Sawhorse assembly upright. We made sure all 4 legs were sitting flush at that 15-degree angle, and then we moved to the cross supports. I marked the center of the inside edge of each leg about halfway up. I measured from the ground up to make sure that my markings were on the same horizontal plane on all 4 legs. I then opened up the sawhorse legs and laid it flat. I added glue and placed the first cross support between 2 legs. Don't worry if you're not catching all the exact measurements. I'm sharing the building plans for free on my website. Find a link in the description box below. I pre-drilled and secured it in place using 3-inch screws. Next, I attached the second cross support to the other 2 legs. Liking what you see? Make sure you tag that thumbs up button. In order for the sawhorse to fold properly, I needed the cross supports to be staggered 3.5 inches so they wouldn't bump into each other. I secured the second support using glue and more 3-inch screws, and then I turned my attention to the top plate. I applied glue to the top edge of the runner and then lowered the top plate in place. I measured to make sure that I had an equal 1.5 inch overhang on either end. I then pre-drilled through the center of the top plate and into the runner. I drove 4 3-inch screws holding the pieces together. With these screws, I made sure to countersink them below the surface of the wood a little bit to prevent any problems with material sitting on top. At this point, the sawhorse was more or less assembled, but it still needed a folding arm to lock everything in place. I decided to use 2x2s. I measured and made a mark 1 inch from the end of either arm. I then clamped the folding arms in place perpendicular on top of the upper cross support. Using a 1/4 inch drill bit, I drilled through the folding arm and into the legs. I then switched to a 3/8 inch drill bit and drilled straight down through the folding arm and into the top cross support. I marked the width of the legs onto the 2x2 and then cut them down to length. In order for the locking arm to swing freely, I enlarged the first hole to 5/16 inch, which is just barely bigger than the 1/4 inch I had previously used. Next, I added a 3/8 inch dowel to the cross support that would work as a pin holding the locking arm in place. I added some wood glue to the hole into the dowel, and then a quick little tip that I like to do is adding a few drops of a quick setting CA glue. The CA glue holds your pieces in place almost like a clamp while the wood glue has time to cure. While everything dried, it was time to add the locking arms. To attach the locking arm to the leg, I used a 5-inch long 1/4 inch lag screw. I made sure to place a washer on either side of the hole through the 2x2. I used my drill and a socket attachment to drive the lags into the leg. I double-checked to make sure that the locking arm wasn't so tight that it couldn't pivot. To help me out, my husband grabbed a handsaw and trimmed the dowels about 1.5 inches from the top of the cross support. If this is the first time you've watched a Pneumatic Addict video, I want to say welcome. I'm glad you're here. Take a second to make sure you hit that subscribe button and bell down below. That way you'll never miss one of my DIY projects. A totally optional but helpful step is to use a sander or even some sandpaper to round over the top edge of the dowel. The slightly rounded edges will make it easier to insert into the hole of the locking arm. The very last step was to add a gate latch, which will hold the sawhorse together when it's not in use. I pre-drilled into the outer edge of the sawhorse and then began to twist the latch into place. I got a quick little tip when you're adding eye screws. Insert a small screwdriver or drill bit at an angle through the hole and twist it around. It will save your fingers and get a tighter fit. I quickly put together a second sawhorse off camera, and now I'm ready for action. These sawhorses are super stable and will be able to hold a lot of weight. They only take a few seconds to set up, and they're easy to move around and store when I need to. I'm telling you, that locking arm and pin make all the difference. Another nice thing about building sawhorses yourself is you can adjust the size and dimensions to meet your needs. If you're a really tall guy or gal, you can add a few inches to the legs and you're golden. And how did they handle the kick test? I'm happy to say the sawhorses are stronger than my toes. We've already started using them on the construction site. We've loaded them up with beams and floor joists, and they're not going anywhere. Cleaning up after any project is definitely the worst part of the process, so I'm glad that these things fold up and can be moved out of the way in just seconds. If you like convenient workspace solutions, make sure you check out my folding portable workbench video. And while you're at it, check out this video as well. I want to know what you plan on using your Sawhorses for, so make sure you leave a comment down below. As always, thanks for watching, guys.